My name is C.J. Walke, and there are plans to, there was a question, there are plans to record, and it's happening right now, so it would be accessible later. So my name is CJ. I work part-time for MOFGA, the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. And most of what I do are kind of outreach with organic farmers and gardeners, focused mostly around organic orcharding, but also organic gardening. And I also host MOFGA's monthly radio show on WERU. 89.9 FM, if anyone is a member or listens to that station. But tonight I'm going to talk about some basics around growing fruit trees organically, kind of in your backyard or small scale. So I do have a presentation, and there's a lot of kind of information on there. I don't intend to read every word that's on every slide, but I'll roll through some of the basics for about close to the first until around 7 o'clock or so, to be able to leave the last half an hour for general questions. So I think if it'll flow most smoothly if we kind of hold all the questions towards the end. Plus, while I'm sharing my screen and presenting, it's hard to see all the different stuff that's happening on, like in the chat box and stuff. So there'll be plenty of time for questions. And with that, I'm just going to get together to share my screen. Make it all big. And then everyone should be able to see what's going on here. So, so again, my name is CJ, and for my role with MOFGA, as far as any kind of follow-up questions, things that happen after the presentation tonight, my email address down at the bottom of the screen, which is cjwalke@mofga.org, is the best way to get a hold of me. I don't have an office or a phone or anything like that. It's essentially just the email address, because I'm very part-time for MOFGA at this point. But don't hesitate to send questions even any time in the future, because that is that's a big part of what I do for MOFGA. So just to touch quickly on certified organic and what are we actually talking about, the reason why I kind of throw this slide in is so that if you're a certified organic farmer, producer, then you're aware of the kind of organic rules and regulations that you need to follow. But for backyard gardeners that want to do things organically, oftentimes there can be confusion in the marketplace around the use of the word organic, especially on gardening products. So if the word organic is printed in big bright letters on the front of a package, it is no guarantee that that product would be allowed for a certified organic farmer to use. However, the OMRI stamp that's down there on the bottom, which is the Organic Materials Review Institute, at this point, most every material or product that's on the shelf that is allowed for organic producers to use should have this very clearly printed on the front. So if that's a choice you're looking to make, the kind of the reassurance there is that OMRI stamp on the front. So just to think a little bit basically, or to start basically thinking organically, really what we're thinking about is the foundations of organic farming and gardening is really the belief that the healthy soil is going to grow a healthy crop. So I'll talk a bit about soil management, provide some resources at the end, but really a lot of what we're focusing on is how to build the soil to maintain long-term and stable fertility for the crops that we're looking to grow, tonight being focused on fruit trees. So really understanding your soil, also learning what are the pests that are out there, the different insects and diseases, And I won't go into great depth on some of these. I'll kind of lean on the question period at the end for what people have had issues with. And I'll mention a few, but really understanding what those challenges might be, or after a couple of years, learning what the challenges are, and then learning the timing and figuring out the point of vulnerability for that pest. So in terms of organic production, there's no silver bullet, as they say. It's really a lot of management and cultivation along the way. But being aware of what you might be up against is really key to prevent issues or address them early on. So, and really a big part of that is kind of working with nature rather than against. So building diversity, supporting beneficial insects, not just pollinators, but those that are going to be looking to feed on larvae, that are looking to feed on your fruit trees or on your fruit. So just being aware of all of that and planning ahead, which is what these workshops are great for. And then I always have this don't just set it and forget it piece, because one of the most common calls or emails that I get over the years is someone that's planted a bunch of trees 6 or 7 years ago, and they're now getting fruit, but it's all covered in bugs or disease. And my answer is always, you should be starting the year of or the year before to be prepared for these fruit trees that are long-term perennial crops. So, and pieces around site selection for trees, if you're looking to plant trees, just think of your fruit trees as being a full sun crop, just like the majority of vegetables that we look to grow in our gardens. So really maximizing the sunlight that the trees can get, and thinking about the sunniest spot in your yard if you're dealing with a smaller footprint. Other things that are really key are air drainage and soil drainage. So in the soil drainage piece, the trees are really not going to like wet feet. So soggy soil, always being kind of damp. Trees might survive, but they might struggle, especially to get established. And long term, they most likely would not be as productive if they're in a better situation for soil. The air drainage piece is really important, because we're always looking for good airflow through the tree, and we can talk somewhat about pruning in the question session at the end. But getting good airflow through the trees based on location is going to help to reduce the amount of time that the leaves or the fruit are wet after either a rain shower in the summer, or even a really humid July day when there's lots of dew and everything is just damp from moisture. So looking to get that moisture to dry up as quickly as possible. Part of the key there is that our diseases, and specifically fungal diseases, require the leaves or the fruit to be wet for a certain amount of time in order for that disease to take hold and start an infection. So one of the keys with pruning is good sunlight and airflow. Part of that is to get the tree to dry out so that that window of potential infection can be kind of minimized, but also location where you're planting. So slopes are great because you get good air movement. Usually there's good moisture movement in the soil, typically not puddled and soggy on a slope. But one thing to think about slopes is that if you're at the lower end of a slope where you come against the tree line, sometimes you can get these little microclimates there at the bottom of the slope and get frost pockets. So as we see more kind of erratic weather patterns and more kind of late spring frosts, like into May, when the fruit trees are in bloom, and we get one of those kind of late spring frosts or freezes, if you're in that kind of frost pocket, you're going to have a little bit colder weather. And when the trees are blooming, if the temperatures get to 28 degrees Fahrenheit or 25 degrees Fahrenheit, you can see a lot of loss to your flowers and your young fruit buds, which means very little to no fruit come fall. So one thing to keep in mind just about location. So, and then The exposure, we always think about southern exposure, maximizing the sunlight throughout the course of the day, early spring weather as things are warming up like they are now, but also thinking about that northern side where maybe things are a little bit slower to break dormancy, a little bit of delayed bud break, maybe things are a little behind what's going on the southern sunny slope. So when you get towards those May, late spring frosts, that maybe those trees are just a little bit behind and don't have open flowers or close to open flowers when those weather changes occur. So I think as our weather patterns are changing, we need to just be able to think about the different variables and ways to adapt. So, and then key again is soil, which is what I'm going to talk about for the next couple slides really, but what I will recommend and what MOFGA recommends in general is really regular soil testing. Organic producers, farmers are look to really get soil tests done every other year. But really, soil tests, I feel, is the best way to know what is going on in your soil in terms of your pH range, your organic matter levels or percentages, and then your major nutrients and micronutrients and what those levels actually are in your soil. So there are ways to kind of learn some growth habits and different things to get an idea about the soil situation, but really the best way to get a good handle on the state of your soil is going through taking a sample and sending it up for analysis, and then selecting the crop that you're looking to grow. Maybe it's your garden vegetables, but there's also fruit trees as an option, and getting recommendations back from the lab on your nutrient needs based on the information that you provide. So I'm not going to read through each of the major nutrients along the way, but one thing to really focus on is part of the picture is what your pH level of your soil is. So a measure of kind of the acid to alkalinity scale there. And fruit trees are usually looking to be somewhere between the 6.0 and 6.5 range, which is a little below neutral. But the key here is to think that, or is to know that in Maine, the majority of our soils, if they've been unworked and haven't been grown on or amended recently, I should say, are going to be acidic. And they could be acidic enough that at those lower pH levels, nutrients that are in the soil might not be available to those plants because the pH range is too acidic. So looking to address your pH levels, which is usually why we're talking about adding lime to the soil, and to raise that pH up will make those nutrients more available to the plants. So part of that is if you're not adjusting or addressing any pH needs in your soil, and you're adding amendments and doing work to build soil, you could be doing things that are just kind of sitting there and not available to the plants because that pH range hasn't been addressed. So that's oftentimes one of the first things we really focus on when starting to work with some new soils. So if you've never done a soil test, the University of Maine, the soil testing service up there is a great resource. So, oops, sorry about that. So this is just, if you've never done a test, or just a quick image. You don't really need to be able to read what's on there, but you get your nutrient kind of grid up at the top, which is a good visual depending on how you learn and how things register. But kind of the meat here of the analysis, the part in the middle, are the recommendations on different materials to use, how many pounds per 1,000 square feet to address the needs of the crop you're growing in your specific soil. So you can buy materials that are general fertilizers that just kind of assume this is what you might need, but depending on different nuances of your location or needs of your soil or crops, really a soil test is the best way to go about it. It's about a $20 to $25 expense, but definitely worth it in the long run. So within that soil test, some of the amendments that'll be recommended, what I want to point out here is that there are different types of limestone. So we always think about adding lime to, say, sweeten the soil is what you might hear. And just some, an old soil needs to be limed, but not all limes are created equal. There are kind of two different types of lime that are available regularly. So just to know that oftentimes what we find at the hardware store, that's the pulverized white lime powder, is that dolomitic limestone, which has calcium and magnesium in it. But in some situations, your magnesium levels may be fine, but you need calcium or to raise the pH. So a calcitic limestone will be the recommendation, which doesn't have magnesium in it. So just something to pay attention to if this is coming on as new information from those recommendations from the soil test, that there may be a recommendation for a specific type of limestone. And then the majority of the materials that we're using in organic production are rock powders, minerals that are not immediately available to, the nutrients are not immediately available to the crop. They really need to be worked on by the biology in the soil. So when we talk about the beneficial fungi and bacteria and different things that are working on these materials and transforming them into the forms that the plants can then take up for their growth and food production. So just some names you might see along the way. So once we kind of get past that site and soil piece, I always want to make sure that people are aware about rootstocks when we talk about fruit trees. So essentially all fruit trees are propagated through the process of grafting, because an apple tree, your Honeycrisp apple that you take the seeds out of, is not going to, if you plant that seed, it is not going to come true to type. So the only way to guarantee the propagation of the same variety is through grafting, and there are various ways. But all of the trees that we are buying to plant out in our yards and gardens have been grafted. So grafted means you're taking the variety of fruit that you're looking to grow, whether it's your Honeycrisp apple or your Reliance peach, and you're taking a piece of that tree and grafting it on to a rootstock, which there are different options out there depending on your fruit. But the rootstock, if you're grafting an apple, your Honeycrisp apple wood onto a rootstock, that rootstock is essentially an apple tree grown for its roots. So we tend to grow all of our fruit trees for the fruit up above, but know that down below, it's a different type of tree that is being grown for the characteristics of the roots. And that's good to know when you're buying trees, to know what type of root system this tree has. So typically, well, let me say that there's kind of three different ranges that you'll find trees that might be referred to as standard trees, and we'll think about within the apple range, but standard trees, also referred to as seedling trees, which are these full size, they bear later in their lives, meaning they take longer to actually start to flower and produce fruit. But they're like the wild trees that we see on the edge of the field, edge of the woods, that could live 150 or more years, and they could get 25 to 30 feet tall if they're not pruned and maintained. But standard trees, full size, long-lived trees. In the middle range, we kind of get into the semi-standards and semi-dwarfs, which are going to be smaller in size, not as long-lived, but they're going to be bearing fruit sooner, but still pretty well long-lived for our purposes. Might live longer than we do after planting. So there's this middle range, which the trees are going to be a lot easier to manage in terms of their overall size as they get older. And then you can get down to dwarfing trees, which some apple varieties or rootstocks might only get to really 6 or 7 feet tall. They might start to produce fruit in just a few years. But within the dwarf rootstock range, typically they're so small and the roots are not very aggressive that dwarf trees need to be staked and they need to be irrigated and oftentimes kept rather weed free because they just can't compete with weeds for nutrients and water in the soil. So when you're buying your trees, getting an idea of that rootstock is good to know for size, because if you have a small space in your backyard or your garden, maybe you're looking for a dwarf or a semi-dwarf tree to fit in there. You're probably not looking for a standard full-size tree. And then based on kind of your space, if you're thinking multiple trees, standard fruit trees and apple trees usually are recommended to be planted 25 to 30 feet apart. When you get into kind of the semi-dwarf, semi-standard range, it could be more like 15 to 20, 12 to 16, depending. And then some of the dwarfing trees could be planted 4 feet apart, 6 feet apart. And in commercial scale, often grown more as a hedge than an individual tree. So just to be aware that there are different options out there and not all trees are created the same. And this is a young tree, a young grafted apple tree, where I just wanted to show some of the difference. And one thing to keep an eye on with your young trees is this spot where the rootstock is coming up from down below. It's a little more kind of light brown color. And then the scion of the fruit tree we're looking to grow is the chunk in the middle where the bark starts to turn a little more reddish purple, and a shoot that grows up. So when we are planting trees, that graft union should be about 4 to 6 inches above ground, above the soil level. We don't want to bury it too deep. We also don't want to mulch up around it, because if things are buried too deep and that graft union is covered, then the scion up above that we've grafted onto could potentially start to put out some roots and start to root itself. So if you bought a semi-dwarf tree for a small space, but you planted it too deeply and roots sprouted from the scion up above, eventually that tree would probably become a 25 to 30 foot tall tree rather than a 10 or 12 foot tall tree that you were hoping to grow. So just to always look at those trees, pretty much any young fruit tree that you buy, you're going to see that little bit of a crook in it that is the graft union, depending on how it was grafted. It's all pretty visible. Another thing to look at was some of the characteristics of rootstock, and this is just a list of some of the apple rootstocks, is that it might tell you, as I mentioned, standard, semi-standard, dwarf.
So the little crook in the apple tree when you buy it is where it's grafted.
Yeah, I remember the Japanese maple.
So another way to look at it that you might see descriptions is by this percentage. So the percentage, if you see something mentioned in sort of a percentage range, the percentage refers to the percentage of growth compared to a full-size kind of wild seedling tree. So the Antonovka rootstocks, standard full-size rootstock, you might see listed as kind of 95% of a full-size tree, where some of the dwarf smaller ones could be referred to as 25%. So that's just another way things are sometimes described or characterized. And that's what that percentage refers to, as compared to a full-size seedling apple tree. Within the realm of fruit that we can grow here in Maine, apples and pears, cherries, plums and peaches, maybe some nectarines. But really looking when you're getting into variety selection, thinking what is hardy to our area and going to work in our growing zone. So in most of Maine, peaches will do well, maybe not up in kind of mountainous regions or further up into a rustic county, but the majority of the state, there are some peach varieties that do well. Something like nectarines might be tough. I feel like we planted a nectarine once a year for a number of years on the MOFGA grounds in Unity, but never really survived the cold winters there in that location. So just thinking about what's going to be growing well in your area. Another piece to think about is within the apple varieties, there are varieties that have been bred to have disease resistance in them. So those varieties would be labeled as disease resistant. Sometimes it just might say DR for disease resistance. But those apple varieties have been bred to be resistant to apple scab. So when we talk about diseases, fungal disease, primary fungal disease that we deal with on our fruit trees is apple scab. And there are a few dozen varieties out there that have been bred to have resistance to apple scab. And it just so happens that the most common ones we see on the grocery store shelf, or we hear about, like McIntosh and Cortland and McCown, varieties like that are all extremely susceptible to apple scab. So if you're looking to grow McIntosh in your backyard in a no spray situation, there will be challenges in managing disease on that tree just based on the variety. So I wrote down PRI apple varieties because one of the breeding programs is through Purdue, Rutgers, and Illinois. And so those varieties, the different names, all have the letters PRI in a section of the name. So things like Prima or Pristine or Williams Pride or Enterprise have that PRI somewhere in the name. And there are some other ones from different breeding programs, but they'll be labeled as disease resistant, and that is really what they're looking or what they're talking about. Also know that when is this fruit going to be ripening? So when it's in the range of apples, you can have apples ripening August through November. Usually things that are ripening for apples sooner in the season might not store as well as the apples that are ripening later in the season. So what's the timing that you're looking for? Are things good for fresh eating or cooking and canning or just straight up storage? Various things. I mean, we can have cherries ripening in July, get some apples, starts of some peaches in August, and things going on through the fall, some other pears as well in August. So just a whole range. And if you're only looking to plant a few trees, just thinking about some variety in there and really what is it that you're looking to eat and what do you love to eat. So within the younger trees, and within the younger trees, just thinking about ground preparations, if you're looking to plant out new trees, if you're able to work the soil the year before, that is I should say most beneficial in an organic situation where most of the fertility materials we are using aren't immediately available to the trees, but might take some time to be worked on by the soil biology. However, I also, when I give these presentations, say that probably 95% of the trees I've planted, I did not prepare the soil the year before. So it's not a requirement, but it definitely helps out in managing things moving forward. Then you can also think about, are you planting out rows of trees and tilling strips of soil for planting, or individual tree spots in kind of a random pattern, or where they fit in your location. Tilled strips work well in terms of being able to kill off grass sod, work on cultivating out weeds, adding amendments. Probably that year before, good to do some cover cropping and soil building along the way, planting trees in those strips, and then managing the soil in between the trees in various ways, whether through mulching or cover cropping or other beneficial plants or food crops in those spaces. But the individual tree spot, which seems to be more common for folks even in gardens or backyard locations, a year before, if you're able to take some cardboard, just brown corrugated cardboard, and set that down on the ground and pile up some compost and some wood chip mulch and other materials to kill off and smother out the grass sod in that location. I've done this in the spring, and by the fall, all of that sod is pretty much killed off and easy to kind of tear apart and dig through, but looking to kill off that sod so you don't have that as a major weed issue coming back into your tree hole immediately. But when you're adding those materials as a mound, when you go to dig, you can kind of mix all those things up, mix in some of the compost and other amendments, use the mulch around the edge to keep the weeds down, keep soil or keep moisture in the soil, and look at things that way. And then you can also think about spring planting versus fall planting. So usually we think about spring as the time to plant fruit trees, but fall planting, once we get into October, when the trees are kind of at that dormant stage, is a fine time to plant as well. Usually spring is pretty busy with all sorts of other activities. So planting trees in the fall is also a viable option. And then within that realm, and thinking about amendments and materials, different products you might use at planting time, there are often differentiations between a spring planting fruit tree mix and a fall planting fruit tree mix. And usually within the nutrient makeup there, we see less of a nitrogen component in the fall planting mix because we're really not looking for the tree to put on growth. We're just looking for the tree to get some roots established before the ground freezes and then be ready to go the following year. So that's just one thing within the product spectrum there to be aware of, that if you are planting in the fall, knowing what products you might be using is helpful so that you don't add excessive nitrogen at that time, which might cause some shoot growth or a little bit of, at that point in October, the tree is going into dormancy to sit through the winter. Usually nitrogen applications can kind of interrupt that dormancy, break it just a little bit, make things a little bit more susceptible to the cold weather that comes along. So fall planting, we're usually just looking to get that tree in the ground and ready to take off in the spring. So to talk just a little bit about underneath the tree and really what can we do there, I like to think the fruit trees aren't just these individual trees planted out in a mowed lawn, but that we're utilizing the space around for other food crops or other plants, annuals and perennials, whether they are food for ourselves or looking to support beneficial insects, pollinators, things that are going to be predators of the pests on our fruit trees, and just mixing it up with some diversity. So this photo is of a plum tree on the MOFGA grounds from a number of years back, but where we were looking to grow various perennials in the area, things that are flowering at different times, growing at different heights, but also always looking to keep the base of the tree relatively weed-free. And when it comes to apples, there's a major pest, which I'll talk about kind of at the very end of this presentation, but keeping the weed pressure down right around the trunk, especially with young trees, not mulching up against the trunk, but keeping the soil somewhat bare in that area. Mulch is great at holding moisture in the soil, but we don't really want moisture to be held against the trunk of the tree. That can cause some various issues. But keeping the tree relatively weed-free, especially the young ones that are looking to get established. If they're planted in the spring and the sod, the quackgrass just runs right in and chokes out that young tree over the course of a year, that tree is going to have some problems long-term. So weeding fruit trees just like we look to weed our gardens. So within what's happening, and one of the kind of key points to think about when we're growing these, fruit trees being perennial woody crops, is that the way that we're building the soil underneath the fruit trees is essentially looking to kind of mimic what's happening in the forest or at the forest edge, where the soil is really being built from the top down. So leaves and dead limbs and things are accumulating on the surface, being slowly decomposed, nutrients are being recycled back into the soil. And that's really a primarily fungal type of decomposition. So to think about using different materials for more of a fungally dominated soil and decomposition that's occurring to recycle nutrients compared to our gardens, which are typically highly bacterial because we're doing a lot of cultivation, we're incorporating a lot of oxygen into the soil when we're doing things like tillage or weeding or even just digging and planting. That oxygen makes things more of a bacteria situation. But when we look to grow these fruit trees, we're never really, we might weed a little bit underneath lightly, but we're never really digging underneath a fruit tree because we don't want to disturb the roots there. So thinking about how do we build the soil from the top down, adding nutrients, adding materials that are going to be recycling their nutrients, kind of a slower, longer term pace for the life of the fruit trees, because they are perennial. Our garden vegetables, mostly being annual, we're looking to kind of crank them up and get them to produce before the frost comes, and that's the end. But fruit trees, we're looking for really more long-term stability. So part of that building soil from the top down and that fungal dominance there is also supporting the beneficial fungi that are going to be in the soil and doing a lot of work for us and for the trees, just happening in the ground that we're not really, that we can't really see, but we should know that it's happening there. And what I'm talking about here are really these mycorrhizal fungi that have a symbiotic relationship with the tree roots, with plant roots, where they're kind of living in and on and around the root systems and doing their own growth and reproduction and feeding throughout the soil. But while that is all happening, they're also able to access nutrients and water that is beyond the reach of the fruit tree itself, and then being able to bring in those nutrients and water as they have their own life cycles and growth and decay, and having those nutrients now more available to the fruit tree by pulling them in closer. So the white fungal hyphae that are here in this picture coming off of kind of the sloping T of a root system of a plant really extends the reach of a root system 10 to 100 times. We read different things all the time, but understanding that trying to have an undisturbed soil with a fungal dominance, promoting these mycorrhizal fungi, are doing a lot to feed the fruit tree for us just with what is in the ground. So that's one thing to be aware of as we're looking to really manage these perennial crops. And oftentimes, to maintain that kind of fungal dominance in the soil, we're looking for these kind of fungal foods, so to speak, which are usually things that are more carbonaceous than nitrogen rich, and things like waste hay, wood chips, and various things help do this for us in the soil. So we'll hear a lot about using ramial wood chips, which the ramial just refers to deciduous wood chips that are 2.5 inches in diameter or less, or from limbs, 2.5 inches in diameter or less. And when you think about, say, a young maple tree or even our apples or peach trees, those younger limbs just have a higher ratio of cambium layer, bud material, and everything to kind of the heartwood of the stem. When we get into bigger limbs and bigger wood, there's a lot more, or there's less kind of nutrient dense tissue on the outside to add to the mix as we're looking to recycle nutrients into the soil. So this kind of picture on the right our fruit tree prunings that were chipped up, pruned in March this time of year, chipped up in the spring, April or May, I forget exactly, but just left in a pile to slowly decompose before being spread around trees in the fall. And digging into that pile, you can see a lot of the white fungal activity decomposing that wood. And essentially just looking to recycle these nutrients back into the soil. So the best thing to do with our fruit tree prunings, in my opinion, is to somehow chip them up or even cut them into smaller pieces so they lay flat on the ground, and just leaving them under the tree to decompose and return those nutrients to the soil. So a good kind of local source of some nutrients. That to take them away and burn them or toss them off into the woods, I feel is kind of a waste of energy and effort, because we put a lot of time into getting these young fruit trees to grow. Then when we're pruning off branches, those are all just little packages of nutrients that should be returned to the soil and not incinerated or burned in a brush pile. Within those pruning things, just to touch quickly, kind of the worst thing you could do is just leave a huge pile of that wood on the edge of your yard or so to sit and rot. Because as that starts to decompose, different wood rots will get into that brush pile that will also look to get into some dead tissue or pruning wounds on your tree. So better to recycle it, chip it, and get it back into the soil than to just leave it in a pile. So beyond the ramial wood chips, other mulches, some waste hay works really well, straw, things that are just going to slowly decompose, but also along the way, they're smothering out weeds. It can help to break up some of that grass sod, which is a pretty tough competitor for water and nutrients with young trees, but also holding moisture in the soil to keep that soil moist, especially as we're getting through the summer, the hotter, drier parts of the summer with young trees. But again, keeping that mulch away from the trunk. So this is a young tree planted in spring, the spring picture, just starting to leaf out. But you can see that I'm keeping the soil around the tree relatively weed-free, piling up the mulch kind of in a ring around where I'm trying to smother off the grass sod that I cut from digging the hole, to keep those roots from just creeping right back into that freshly disturbed and backfilled soil for the tree. So trying to suppress some of that growth and just reduce competition for that young tree. And then of course there's compost. We always talk about compost in organic gardening and farming situations, but it's good to know that compost really isn't a strong fertilizer of any type. Oftentimes it's considered more of a soil conditioner. So by using compost, we're adding organic matter to the soil, which is going to help build soil structure and help with managing moisture in the soil, and also providing a place for our kind of beneficial microbes to live as we're looking to grow our crops. So one thing to think about, orchard compost versus garden compost. Usually if we're talking about an orchard compost, we're thinking more of a cold compost pile. So something that isn't turned regularly, usually not looking to get up to 150 or 160 degrees in the composting process as the bacteria are really getting active. But usually they're more static piles, slowly decomposing. Usually you're going to have a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than a hot pile that's actively turned, but slowly decomposing in more of a fungal scenario. So when we go to add that material, we have a little bit of that fungal base already occurring in that compost. So, but also compost is a fantastic way to recycle nutrients from the crops that we're growing and return them back to the soil in more stable forms along the way. Another piece about compost that can help for disease management with fruit trees, especially in the scab range. Apple scab I've mentioned a few times. Pears also have some scab, but there are other fungal diseases that will overwinter on infected fruit that's on the ground, or infected leaves that are on the ground. So looking to speed up the decomposition of those infected leaves and fruit and getting them to decompose late fall, early spring, before we get into April and May, when infection periods can start, will help limit the amount of that fungus that's present and just sitting there waiting to go in the spring. So spreading compost in the fall around our fruit trees and doing a little bit of mowing, trying to manage the leaves. Mowing helps chop up the leaves, mix them up a little bit, get them to decompose a little bit quicker because they're broken down more from the mowing. Compost helping with the process. You can also spread lime at that time to help with that decomposition process, but using it as one of the tools to help manage disease, which is really something we should think about year round, and not just when we're harvesting fruit that might have some blemishes on there. I have a couple pictures just of a new fruit tree row that we planted at MOFGA. I mean, this is probably 10 or 12 years ago now, but if not a little more. But fruit trees, got a cultivated strip the year before that was amended, soil tested, amended, cover cropped for a season, then planted in the spring. The trees are you can see some of the grade stakes with the orange at the top, but just allowing things to kind of grow back up. Great mix of various plants that are flowering. But then as things were getting into kind of mid-June, late June or so, coming back through that row, and I used a little bit, a scythe for a little bit, but also a weed whacker, just to cut down that grass and competition, and then using that to kind of rake up around the trees as a mulch that was grown right there in place. So part of this was to try to limit regular mowing twice a week that produces a really thick grass sod that is tough competition for young root trees or young fruit trees and their root systems, but letting all sorts of other things, different perennials and annuals, grow as well helps to kind of break up the soil. You don't see as much of a dense sod that way, but then also cutting them down and using that material as a mulch and getting those nutrients to just slowly decompose and recycle along the way. So there's different ways to manage the ground that's going around your young fruit trees. And then for the last couple slides, kind of the primary pest, just thinking about young fruit trees that I want to mention, is this round-headed apple borer, which is a beetle that's the adult on the left. But these beetles are laying as a primary pest of young fruit trees in organic situations, laying their eggs right in the bark at the soil line, and then the young larva is hatching out and burrowing around in the tree, feeding off the cambium layer. They can be in the tree for a couple seasons and do quite a bit of damage as they travel around. And this is oftentimes the killer of a fruit tree that's just been planted in the past couple years, because you're not aware that the damage is occurring and everything looks fine until the tree starts to leaf out in the spring. Everything looks normal, and then within the matter of a week, all the leaves shrivel up brown and the tree is dead, because this little larva on the right side has essentially girdled the tree, but just underneath the bark where you can't see. So being aware with young trees that this this is a common pest, learning to identify the signs, which really the primary sign is if one of these larvae is feeding in your tree, you will find at the soil line signs of it, or you'll see it's frass. And the frass is essentially the larval poop that's coming out from the hole where the egg was laid and where the larva is feeding just on the inside. but it looks like an orange moist sawdust when you see it. It might be just below the soil, so you might have to kind of scratch back the soil just a ½ inch or so. But if you find signs of this frass, then what's happened here in the picture on the right is using a sharp knife to kind of carve out that damaged bark area and look to expose the larva and destroy it so it doesn't continue feeding off of your fruit trees and potentially killing a tree. If it doesn't kill the tree, oftentimes the tree has been weakened enough that maybe later on in its growth, under full fruit load and a storm in the summer, there's too much weight on the tree and it can snap off right at ground level. So there's various ways that this pest can cause issues in young apple trees. And just to highlight that, last weekend, just this past Saturday, I led a pruning workshop at a location over in Hancock, where some trees had been planted a few years ago, but not really maintained along the way. And we found one tree that wasn't obviously dead, but as soon as we dug around, we found 2 of these larvae in there, and the tree essentially just snapped right over with just some light pressure and was essentially dead and not going to do anything this year. So it's one of those pests that can creep up on you, and killing a young tree, I feel like, is more significant than some blemishes on a few apples or some bumps that you can cut around or make sauce or or cider out of. But again, here, just to know, there's a bit on the kind of the life cycle around the pest. But if you do have this pest in your young trees, if they're there for a couple seasons, usually by the time we get into April, just a few weeks away, and things start to warm up, if that larva is overwintering in the tree and starting to feed, we'll see signs of frass from existing larvae in April. But usually, if eggs are being laid a little bit later spring, earlier summer, it might not be until June or July that you start to see some of that frass from new larvae that are in the tree. But it's a great thing to look for at all times, especially when you're doing a little bit of weeding and keeping those trees somewhat free and clear. Another piece is, if you can't find the larva, just doing a little bit of carving with your knife. Sometimes they make little tunnels towards the roots. You can use a wire or something relatively stiff to just probe down in those cavities and look to squish the larva that's down in there. And then just kind of final slide. I know I've been talking straight for an hour, but some great resources for fruit trees in general. The Maine Cooperative Extension has the tree fruit site, a whole bunch of pages full of information, a whole section on growing fruit trees in Maine that's full of great fact sheets and videos as well. Fedco Trees has great resources for essentially all of the fruit varieties that they are offering for sale, which is quite extensive, which are all going to grow and do fine for us here in Maine, but also great general information on ways to manage different pests and diseases, a whole kind of interactive section on how to think about which apple variety to choose based on ripening time, uses, and things like that. So great resource there. If you're looking to learn more about rootstocks in general, then Willamette Nurseries, which is out in, it's either Oregon or Washington, maybe it's Oregon, but they have a great website with lots of detailed information about various rootstocks for fruit trees, so you can learn a little bit more that way. And then, of course, MOFGA, looking at for other events, this one tonight with the co-op being co-sponsored with MOFGA, but trying to find other events out there to learn more along the way about growing your fruit trees.